That stormy night changed everything. Through our security camera, I watched my father drag my grandfather outside and slam the door. Grandpa stood trembling in the rain, clutching his thin coat. 3 weeks later, he died in my arms. But what he left behind would destroy my family forever. If you are watching this, kindly subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. And I hope that you're safe, wherever you are. My name is Emma Patterson. I'm 16, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect family. We lived in the wealthy suburbs of Denver, Colorado, where manicured lawns stretched like green carpets and every house looked like a magazine cover. My dad, Michael Patterson, owned a successful real estate company. My mom, Sandra, spent her days at charity luncheons and yoga classes. But the most important person in my world lived 3 hours away in a small mountain town called Silverton. My grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, was 79 and owned a sprawling cattle ranch that had been in our family for 4 generations. The Mitchell Ranch wasn't just land, it was our legacy. Every summer since I could remember, I'd spend weeks with Grandpa Tom. He taught me to ride horses, milk cows, and fix fences with these weathered hands that could gentle the wildest stallion. His eyes were the brightest blue I'd ever seen, like mountain lakes reflecting summer sky. "Emma, darling," he'd say in his gentle voice, "this land tells our family story. Every tree, every stream, every acre holds the dreams of your great-great-grandfather who first claimed this soil." I loved everything about the ranch, the way the morning mist clung to the valley, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the smell of fresh hay and wildflowers. Most of all, I loved listening to Grandpa's stories about our ancestors who built this place with their bare hands. My grandmother, Lily, had passed away 2 years earlier from cancer. I watched Grandpa's spirit break that day. He never quite recovered. He started walking slower, talking softer, spending long hours sitting on the porch, staring at the mountains where they'd scattered her ashes. That's when my parents started their visits. Before Grandma died, my parents rarely visited the ranch. Dad always complained about the long drive, the poor cell service, and what he called that backwards mountain lifestyle. But suddenly, they were driving up every other weekend, bringing expensive gifts and talking about Grandpa's golden years. I should have known something was wrong, but I was 15, focused on school and friends, and all the drama that feels so important when you're that age. I trusted my parents completely. The first time I heard them talking about selling the ranch, I was eavesdropping from the kitchen while they sat on the porch with Grandpa. Dad's voice carried through the screen door, smooth and persuasive like when he was closing a real estate deal. "You've worked your whole life, Tom," he was saying. "Don't you think it's time to rest, to enjoy your remaining years without worrying about cattle and repairs and harsh winters?" My heart stopped. Sell the ranch, that was impossible. The ranch was everything to Grandpa. It was everything to our family. But my parents were persistent. Every visit brought new arguments about Grandpa's age, his health, his isolation. They painted pictures of a comfortable retirement home, professional medical care, and being closer to family. "Think about Emma," Mom would say, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Don't you want to spend more time with your granddaughter?" I wanted to scream that I'd rather spend time with him at the ranch, but something kept me silent. Maybe it was the way Grandpa's shoulders seemed to sag a little more with each conversation. What I didn't know then was that my parents had already done their research. They'd discovered the ranch was worth $3.5 million. To them, Grandpa wasn't a beloved family member. He was an obstacle standing between them and a fortune. But Grandpa loved me. He loved our family, and when they promised him they'd take care of him forever, if he sold the ranch, he believed them. The day he agreed to sell, I felt something inside me die. But what came next would be so much worse. Have you ever watched someone you love make a decision you knew they'd regret? That's how I felt the day Grandpa finally agreed to sell the Mitchell Ranch. The pressure campaign had been building for months. My parents visited every weekend now, each time with new arguments about why Grandpa should sell. They brought real estate brochures showing luxury retirement communities. They printed articles about elderly people living alone and the dangers of isolation. Dad would sit across from Grandpa at the old oak dining table, spreading papers like a general planning battle. "Look at these medical facilities, Tom," he'd say, pointing to glossy photos. 24-hour nursing staff, activity programs. You'd never be lonely again. Mom played her role perfectly, dabbing her eyes with tissues and talking about how worried she was. I can't sleep at night thinking about you out here all alone, she'd whisper. What if you fell? What if something happened and we couldn't reach you? I sat in the corner doing homework, pretending not to listen while my heart broke with every word. They were making Grandpa sound like a helpless old man when he was still sharp as a tack, still capable, still the strongest person I knew. But I could see him wavering. Grandma's death had left him vulnerable in ways he'd never been before. For 56 years, she'd been his partner, his anchor, his reason for everything. Without her, the ranch felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that hurt. I just miss her so much, he confided to me one afternoon, as we sat on the porch swing. Sometimes I hear her voice calling from the kitchen, and I forget for a moment that she's gone. My parents exploited that grief ruthlessly. They convinced him that holding on to the ranch was holding on to pain, that selling would free him to start fresh, to heal, to find happiness again. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal conversation in late September. I was supposed to be asleep, but I crept downstairs and listened from the stairwell as my parents laid out their final ultimatum. "We've found the perfect place," Dad said, his voice taking on that hard edge he used when a real estate deal was taking too long. "Sunset Manor, it's only 20 minutes from our house. Emma could visit every day after school. But if you wait much longer," Mom added, her voice trembling with practiced emotion, "the waiting list will be too long. You could miss your chance and then what? You'll be stuck here, alone, getting older and weaker every day." I heard Grandpa's sharp intake of breath, then silence that stretched so long I thought maybe he'd left the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "If I sell the ranch, you promise you'll take care of me. You'll make sure I'm not a burden." "Of course," Dad said immediately. "Your family, we'll handle everything. The sale, the move, your care. All you have to do is sign the papers." "And Emma?" Grandpa asked. "I can still see Emma every day," Mom promised. "She loves you so much, this way she won't have to worry about you either." That's when I heard the sound that still haunts my dreams. My grandfather, this man who'd built a life with his bare hands, who'd raised cattle and crops and children on land his own grandfather had claimed, began to cry. They'd broken him. They'd taken a proud, independent man and convinced him he was nothing but a burden. They'd used his love for me as a weapon against him. "Okay," he whispered through his tears. "I'll sell the ranch." The papers were signed within a week. Dad handled everything through his real estate connections, ensuring the sale moved quickly before Grandpa could change his mind. The buyer was a development company planning to subdivide the land for luxury mountain homes. 4 generations of Mitchell family history sold to the highest bidder. $3.5 million transferred into my parents' account, with the written promise that they would provide Grandpa with care, housing, and family support for the rest of his life. I watched from my bedroom window as Grandpa packed his belongings into boxes, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was handling pieces of his own heart. When he carefully wrapped the photo of him and Grandma on their wedding day, I had to muffle my sobs with a pillow. The man who'd taught me that land wasn't just property, but family legacy was losing everything he'd spent his life protecting. And my parents couldn't have been happier. But Grandpa had signed that contract in good faith, trusting that his son would honor both the letter and spirit of their agreement. He had no idea what they really planned to do with him. At first, I thought maybe I'd been wrong about my parents. Maybe they really did want to take care of Grandpa. They set him up in the guest bedroom on the first floor of our house, complete with a new adjustable bed, a reclining chair, and a small TV. Mom bought him soft pajamas and slippers. Dad installed grab bars in the attached bathroom. "See how much we care about your grandfather?" Mom would say whenever neighbors or friends visited. "We wanted him close so we could make sure he's comfortable and safe." Grandpa seemed lost in our modern suburban house. After 79 years of mountain air and wide-open spaces, being surrounded by beige walls and central air conditioning made him look smaller somehow. But he tried to adapt. He'd sit in his chair watching old westerns, or shuffle around the backyard, examining Mom's flower beds. "These roses are pretty," he'd tell her at dinner, "but they're nothing like the wild flowers that grow up near Eagle's Peak." "That's nice, Dad." Mom would respond without looking up from her phone. I spent every moment I could with him. I'd sit on the floor beside his chair while he told me stories about the ranch, about the time a bear wandered into the barn, or how Grandma once saved a newborn calf during a blizzard. His eyes would light up when he talked about the past, but they'd dim again when he looked around our sterile suburban house. "I miss the sounds," he told me one evening. "The wind in the trees, the cattle calling, the creek bubbling over the rocks. Here, all I hear are cars and air conditioners." I wanted to take him home so badly it hurt. But home was gone. Bulldozers had already started clearing the land for those luxury homes. The changes in my parents' behavior started small. Impatience when Grandpa moved too slowly. Sighs when he forgot which medicines to take. Eye rolls when he told the same story twice. "He's getting repetitive," Dad complained to Mom one night, not caring that I could hear from the kitchen. "And he smells like that old man smell. Can't you do something about that?" "He's grieving," I said, unable to stay quiet any longer. "He just needs time to adjust." "Emma, you don't understand," Mom snapped. "Taking care of an elderly person is more work than you realize. We're doing our best." But their best started looking more like bare minimum. Grandpa's meals became simpler and smaller. Instead of cooking the foods he enjoyed, Mom would serve him whatever was easiest: soup from a can, frozen dinners, leftover takeout. His laundry got done less frequently. His room was cleaned less often. When he asked for help adjusting his TV or reaching something from a high shelf, the responses became shorter and more irritated. "Can't you do anything for yourself?" I heard Dad mutter one afternoon when Grandpa asked for help opening a jar of pickles. I started paying closer attention. Watching, documenting in my diary the small cruelties I witnessed. The way Mom would ignore Grandpa when he tried to join dinner conversations. How Dad would turn up the TV volume when Grandpa was trying to talk. The impatient sighs when he needed help with anything. Grandpa never complained. He'd apologize constantly, for needing help, for being in the way, for existing. This man who'd once commanded respect from everyone who knew him was shrinking into himself, becoming smaller and quieter every day. "I don't want to be a bother," he'd whisper to me. "I know this is hard for your parents. You're not a bother," I'd tell him fiercely. "Your family. They promised to take care of you." But I was starting to realize that my parents' promises weren't worth the paper they were written on. The first real incident happened 3 months after Grandpa moved in. It was a Sunday morning, and he was trying to make himself breakfast. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and he accidentally dropped a plate, which shattered on the kitchen floor. I was upstairs getting dressed when I heard Dad's voice, loud and angry. "Damn it, Tom. Can't you be more careful? Do you know how much those dishes cost?" "I'm sorry." Grandpa's voice was shaking. "I'll clean it up." "No, don't touch anything else. You'll probably cut yourself and then we'll have to deal with a trip to the emergency room." I ran downstairs to find Grandpa standing in the kitchen in his pajamas, looking down at the broken pieces with tears in his eyes. Dad was sweeping aggressively, muttering under his breath about clumsy old men and constant messes. "It was an accident," I said, my voice tight with anger. "Stay out of this, Emma," Dad snapped. "You don't have to deal with this every day." That's when I realized the truth. My parents didn't see Grandpa as family anymore. They saw him as a burden they were stuck with. The golden cage they'd built for him was still a cage, and I was starting to understand that things were going to get much worse. What would you do if you discovered your own parents were monsters? By winter, the mask had completely slipped away. My parents no longer bothered hiding their resentment when neighbors weren't around. Grandpa had become the unwanted house guest who'd overstayed his welcome, except he had nowhere else to go. The care they'd promised became neglect, disguised as convenience. Instead of home-cooked meals, Grandpa got whatever was fastest. Breakfast was cold cereal or toast. Lunch was a sandwich if he was lucky. Dinner was often just leftovers microwaved and shoved in front of him without a word. His medication schedule, which should have been carefully monitored, became hit or miss. I started keeping track myself, reminding my parents when Grandpa needed his blood pressure pills or his heart medication. "He's not your responsibility, Emma." Mom would snap when I brought it up. "We're handling it." But they weren't handling it. They were ignoring it, hoping the problem would somehow solve itself. Grandpa's room, which had started as a comfortable guest space, gradually filled with storage boxes, holiday decorations, and items my parents didn't want cluttering the rest of the house. His bed was pushed against the wall to make room for Mom's exercise equipment. The small TV was replaced with an even smaller one when Dad wanted the good one for his home office. I don't mind, Grandpa would tell me when I complained about the cramped conditions. I don't need much space, but I minded. I minded everything. I minded the way Dad would walk past Grandpa in the hallway without acknowledgement. I minded how Mom would talk about him in third person while he was sitting right there. I minded the constant references to him as the old man instead of using his name. Most of all, I minded how small he was becoming. This man who used to fill a room with his presence, who commanded respect from ranch hands and neighbors alike, was disappearing before my eyes. The breaking point came on a February night, when Colorado was hit by one of the worst blizzards in years. The wind howled like something alive and angry, rattling the windows and piling snow against the doors. I was in my room doing homework when I heard raised voices from the kitchen. Through my bedroom door, I could make out Dad's angry tone and Grandpa's quieter responses. I crept to the top of the stairs to listen. "I specifically told you not to touch the thermostat," Dad was saying, his voice cold with fury. "Do you have any idea how much our heating bill has been since you moved in?" "I was just cold," Grandpa said softly. "I only turned it up 2 degrees. 2 degrees costs money, Tom. Money I'm already spending on your food, your medicine, your doctor visits. Did you think this was all free?" The words hit me like physical blows. Dad was talking about Grandpa like he was some charity case instead of family, like the $3.5 million from the ranch sale had somehow disappeared. "I'm sorry," Grandpa whispered. "I didn't realize." "You never realize." Mom's voice joined the conversation, sharp and cutting. "You live in your own little world where other people pay for everything and clean up your messes." I wanted to run downstairs and scream at them, but something kept me frozen on the stairs. Maybe it was shock that my own parents could be so cruel. Maybe it was fear of what they might do if I interfered. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. The sound of a plate hitting the floor. More broken dishes. "That's it," Dad roared. "I've had enough of your carelessness. Please," Grandpa's voice was shaking. "I'll clean it up. I'll pay for new plates." "With what money? You don't have any money, remember? You gave it all to us." There was a moment of terrible silence. Then I heard footsteps. Heavy, angry footsteps moving toward the back door. "Michael, what are you doing?" Mom's voice held a note of alarm, teaching him a lesson about being more careful. I crept further down the stairs until I could see into the kitchen. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. Dad had grabbed Grandpa by the arm and was pulling him toward the back door. Grandpa, wearing only his thin pajamas and slippers, was stumbling to keep up. "Please," Grandpa was saying. "I'm sorry, I'll be more careful." But Dad wasn't listening. He yanked open the back door, letting in a blast of freezing air and swirling snow. "Maybe some time outside will help you think about being less clumsy," Dad said and pushed Grandpa out onto the covered porch. The door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked. I ran to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Outside, Grandpa stood on the porch in his pajamas, arms wrapped around himself, shivering in the bitter wind. Snow was already collecting on his thin shoulders. "Mom," I screamed, running into the kitchen. "You have to let him back in. He'll freeze. He'll be fine," she said, not even looking up from loading the dishwasher. "It's covered out there. A few minutes in the cold will teach him to be more careful." "A few minutes." I stared at her in horror. "It's below zero. He's 79 years old." "Emma, go to your room," Dad ordered. "This doesn't concern you." But it did concern me. Everything about this concerned me. I ran back to the window and watched my grandfather huddle against the wind, his bare feet already turning blue in his thin slippers. He wasn't fighting to get back in. He wasn't pounding on the door or shouting. He just stood there, accepting this punishment like he deserved it. That's when I knew my parents weren't just neglectful or impatient. They were cruel, deliberately, calculatingly cruel. And if I couldn't let them kill my grandfather, they were going to kill him. I waited 20 minutes, watching through the window as Grandpa grew weaker and more unsteady on the icy porch. My parents had gone to bed, satisfied that their lesson would make him more compliant. They were wrong. I snuck downstairs and unlocked the back door. Grandpa collapsed into my arms, The moment I opened it, his body shaking so violently I could barely hold him up. "Emma," he whispered through chattering teeth. "You shouldn't, your parents will be—" "I don't care about my parents," I said, helping him inside. "I care about you." I wrapped him in every blanket I could find and made him hot tea with shaking hands. His lips were blue, his fingers white with frostbite. If I'd waited much longer, he might have died on that porch. "Why did you let them do that to you?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. "Because I don't want to be more trouble than I already am," he said softly. "They're taking care of me, Emma. I owe them everything. You don't owe them anything. They owe you. You gave them $3.5 million. But Grandpa had been so beaten down, so convinced he was worthless, that he couldn't see the truth anymore. That night changed everything for me. I started documenting every instance of abuse, every cruel word, every accident that left Grandpa hurt or humiliated. I used my phone to record conversations. I took photos of his bruises when he fell. I wrote down every meal he missed, every medication dose he was denied. I also started planning. My parents thought they were so smart, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd never bothered to check whether the house security system I'd installed for a school project actually worked. It did, and it recorded everything, including the night they left Grandpa outside to freeze. Over the next month, I watched my grandfather fade away. Not just physically, though the cold exposure had weakened him significantly, but spiritually. The spark that made him who he was dimmed a little more each day. He stopped telling stories about the ranch. He stopped asking about my school. He barely spoke at all, unless directly questioned. My parents, meanwhile, were living it up. Dad bought a new BMW. Mom redecorated the entire house. They took weekend trips to Aspen and talked about buying a vacation home in Cabo, all with Grandpa's money, while he wasted away in their guest room. I spent every free moment with him, trying to keep his spirits up, but I could see him slipping away, and not just from old age. From heartbreak. From the crushing weight of realizing that the son he'd loved and trusted saw him as nothing more than a burden. The end came on a rainy Tuesday in April. I found him that morning when I went to check on him before school. He was lying peacefully in his bed, his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow I almost missed it. "Grandpa," I whispered, taking his cold hand. His eyes fluttered open, focusing on me with effort. "Emma, sweetheart. I'm here," I said, tears already starting. "I'm right here. I need to tell you something," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Under my mattress. There's an envelope. For you." I wanted to tell him not to talk, to save his strength, but I could see in his eyes that time was running out. "I'm sorry," he breathed. "Sorry you had to see. Sorry I couldn't." "Don't apologize," I said fiercely. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing." He smiled then, a real smile for the first time in months. "You're the best thing in my whole life, Emma. Remember that." Those were his last words. I held his hand as his breathing grew slower and finally stopped. I kissed his forehead and whispered all the things I wished I'd said before. How much I loved him. How proud I was to be his granddaughter. How sorry I was that I couldn't protect him. Then I reached under his mattress and found the envelope. Inside was a letter in his shaky handwriting, along with a key and a piece of paper with numbers written on it. The letter was addressed to me. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then my time has come. I want you to know that the only light in these dark months has been your love and kindness. You kept me going when I wanted to give up. I know what your parents did to me. I'm not as naive as they think. I also know you tried to protect me, and I love you for that." The key opens a safety deposit box at First Mountain Bank in Silverton, box number 247. Inside, you'll find documents that tell the real story of what happened to me and to the ranch. I made sure to document everything, sweetheart. Every broken promise, every cruel word, every moment of neglect. I may not have been strong enough to fight back, but I was smart enough to prepare. Use what you find to get justice. Not for revenge, but for truth. Don't let them get away with what they've done. I love you always, Grandpa Tom. I clutched the letter to my chest and sobbed. Even in his final days, even broken and beaten down, my grandfather had been thinking of me, planning for justice. My parents played their parts perfectly at the funeral. Dad gave a eulogy about what a wonderful father Tom had been. Mom cried prettily into a lace handkerchief. They accepted condolences from neighbors who praised them for taking such good care of him in his final months. I stood in the back, watching this performance, and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd gotten away with murder. But Grandpa had left me the tools I needed to destroy them, and I was going to use every single one. Could you take your own family to court for justice? 3 days after Grandpa's funeral, I skipped school and drove to Silverton. I'd just gotten my license, and my parents were too busy spending their inheritance to pay attention to where I went. The safety deposit box contained more evidence than I'd dared hope for. Grandpa had documented everything: photos of his deteriorating living conditions, audio recordings of my parents' cruel comments made on a hidden voice recorder he'd somehow managed to operate, copies of medical records showing how his health declined after moving in with us. But the most damning evidence was a detailed journal he'd kept, written in his careful handwriting, documenting every instance of abuse, neglect, and humiliation. March 15th. Michael told me I smell like death and need to shower more. Sandra laughed and said maybe that's just how old people smell naturally. March 22nd. Dropped my medicine bottle and pills scattered. Michael made me pick them up on my hands and knees, said maybe next time I'd be more careful. April 3rd. Sandra served dinner to Michael and Emma, but said I could make do with leftover soup. It was cold. April 10th. Asked if I could call my old neighbor Bob to see how he's doing. Michael said long-distance calls cost money, and I shouldn't waste their resources on pointless conversations. Page after page of documented cruelty. Each entry was dated and detailed, written in the shaky handwriting of a man whose spirit was being slowly crushed. But the most important document was at the bottom of the box, a copy of the ranch sale contract with a handwritten note from Grandpa's lawyer. The contract clearly stated that in exchange for the $3.5 million, my parents were legally obligated to provide Grandpa with appropriate housing, medical care, nutritious meals, and emotional support befitting his dignity as a family member. They had violated every single term. I drove back to Denver with a car full of evidence and a heart full of determination. But I was still just 16. I needed help. That help came from an unexpected source: Mrs. Rodriguez, my AP history teacher, who'd noticed my absences and declining grades since Grandpa's death. "Emma, can you stay after class?" she asked on Friday afternoon. I sat across from her desk, trying to look like a normal grieving teenager, instead of someone plotting to destroy her own parents. "I know you were close to your grandfather," she said gently. 2 years later, I'm 18 and about to start college on a full scholarship to study social work. The settlement money sits in a trust fund, but I'm not using it for luxury cars or expensive clothes. Instead, I've started the Thomas Mitchell Foundation for Elder Justice. We provide legal aid for elderly people facing abuse, safe housing for those who need to escape dangerous situations, and education programs about elder rights. The foundation operates out of a restored farmhouse in Silverton, just 5 miles from where Grandpa's ranch used to be. I bought back as much of the original land as I could, though the main house had already been demolished for those luxury homes. But I rebuilt the barn exactly as it was, using photos from Grandpa's albums. Now it serves as the foundation's main office, where a team of lawyers, social workers, and volunteers help protect the elderly from predators like my parents. We've helped over 200 families in 2 years. Every case reminds me why this work matters. My parents were released on parole after serving 3 years each. They've never tried to contact me, which is fine. I have a new family now. The volunteers and staff who share Grandpa's vision of treating elders with dignity and respect. Last month, I received a letter from an elderly woman in Wyoming whose son was trying to steal her ranch. She'd heard about our foundation and hoped we could help. "My grandson doesn't believe me when I tell him what's happening," she wrote. "But I have recordings, just like that brave girl in Colorado. We took her case, we got her justice. And I thought about how proud Grandpa would be that his sacrifice is still protecting other families." Some people ask if I regret sending my own parents to prison. The answer is simple. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that they chose greed over love. I regret that Grandpa died believing he was worthless. But I don't regret fighting for justice. I don't regret exposing the truth. And I don't regret keeping the promise I made to the man who taught me everything about honor, integrity, and standing up for what's right. Grandpa used to say that land tells the story of the families who love it. The Mitchell Ranch is gone, but our story continues. Not in acres of grass and cattle, but in every elderly person we help, every predator we stop, every family we keep together. That's a legacy worth more than any ranch. That's a legacy Grandpa would be proud of. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more stories about justice, family, and the courage to do what's right, even when it costs everything. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And remember, if you or someone you know is facing elder abuse, help is available. You don't have to fight alone.